Thank you for joining the Business Over Breakfast podcast. I'm your host, Steven Rosenthal, and we are going to be jumping into another great episode, learning how I am starting to grow this business. Thanks again for tuning in to Business Over Breakfast. I have some exciting news today for you on YouTube this morning. I got a shipment in this morning, or yesterday afternoon, of some mugs. If you're seeing my screen, I've got the Business Over Breakfast podcast logo on a coffee mug on one side, and then I have the Aura Media logo on the other side. Got all my swag yesterday. Very excited about it. It's the little things. I also got a Business Over Breakfast mouse pad. I highly doubt any of you want any of this stuff, but if you do, shoot me a DM on LinkedIn. How's that? And then I also got Aura Media coasters, nice cork back. So exciting times here at Aura Media. Also got some pens, but they're out of reach. Anyway, the topic today, what makes a good podcast guest? So, a podcast guest is an important component, obviously, to any podcast, especially if you're somebody like Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan. I was just listening to this morning to Tim Ferriss's podcast that he released, I believe a couple of days ago with Jamie Foxx, longtime favorite of the Tim Ferriss show. But a podcast guest can serve a multitude of functions, can be important for a multitude of reasons. But as you're likely guessing at this point, I'm going to focus on how a podcast that's focused on a marketing or building a business, what the power of a podcast guest entails for that sort of endeavor. So, if you're a software company creating a podcast about e-commerce and you want to bring on a guest, so your software enables e-commerce websites to function well. Say it's a Shopify-esque back-end tool that can manage your inventory, manage your accounting for an e-commerce site. So say you have Shopify has a podcast that's everything e-commerce, everything from marketing to the finances to drop shipping to contract manufacturing, everything. So what makes a good podcast guest? Well, and I touched on this in how to grow your business through podcasting, that episode. But I'm gonna really focus on three main areas. What makes a good podcast guest? One, and you're likely familiar listening to podcasts here or YouTube channels. It's really important that you're establishing credibility within your podcast. So you want to be a go-to source of credible, trustworthy information. So a podcast guest can immediately offer that credibility or that trust. If I'm doing a podcast on podcasting and I have, next to me Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss, I immediately have the credibility in my podcast, and it's immediately seen as a trustworthy source of information. There is a podcast that recently launched that is an interview with CMOs or marketing leaders in various businesses that I've been listening to. There's like 3 episodes out, and it hit the top 50 on Apple Podcasts. And a lot of that is because they're very credible guests. Yesterday there was an episode released of a CMO of a $100 million software as a service, software company, security company. And that immediately brings so much credibility to the content that you're releasing on your podcast. So number one, credibility. And I think that is a super important point for somebody who's just starting out in podcasting. Number one, credibility in a podcast guest. the way that I have seen this done well is by leveraging your network. So, if you're Shopify and Toby Lutka, say he, CEO of Shopify, started a podcast, and he brings on, the CEO of, I don't know, say he brings on like Kylie Jenner, or like the CEO of, Kendall Scott, or some large enterprise that's really killed it in e-commerce, immediately has a lot of credibility there. Tough thinking on my feet with the e-commerce side. I haven't really dabbled much. So what else makes a good podcast guest? If you are a business and using your podcast for some business endeavor, you really want to have a diversity of value in your guests. So the content needs to be diverse enough to bring value in multiple sectors for the listener. So for instance, that CMO podcast I was talking about, we have one CMO was part of Gong, the sales enablement tool. I forget what category they're in, but they basically are revenue intelligence. There you go. They, the diversity and value, that CMO is manning a 17-person team. The economics of that person's budget, Udi, the CMO of Gong, the economics of his budget, the processes that he has in place, his philosophy on marketing, makes sales easier. All those various components are different than the last guest, who is a CMO of a $100 million company. So for instance, say you were doing that podcast for the construction industry as a CPA firm that I mentioned. You want to, interview ABC, a roofing and siding supplier. You want to interview, maybe the CEO of the CPA firm for a financial perspective. So, a good guest brings diversity to the content, and brings different facets. If you think of like a diamond, and every way that you turn that diamond, you see it in a different light, you understand it in a different way, you see its beauty in a kind of a different light and different facet. So you want your podcast guests to bring that and say the diamond is the topic, or the value that listeners are looking to achieve, and your guests are shining lights on different perspectives on that value, and your guests can do that. You may not be able to do that as the podcast host, so you want to bring in a series of guests that are going to be able to do that well. The last thing that's super tactical and good for, maybe a business that is just dabbling into podcasting, not really sure how it's going to help the business, and the CEO may not be bought in, maybe the marketing team's not bought in, or maybe a salesperson wants to do the podcast for a company and is not sure how this is going to actually help them meet their quota. This is a really good short-term tactical idea here, and is the third and final point for short-term benefits of a podcast. That is, bring your prospects onto your podcast to interview them. Now, obviously, depending on depending on the product or service that you're selling to that prospect, you may not be able to have a full-blown discovery call on your show, but you could talk in broader strokes with a prospect about the challenges and problems that they see someone in their shoes having, even if they don't necessarily want to say, hey, my business is struggling financially with cash flow and we need to, better BI tool. Maybe they could say, during COVID, businesses like mine in the industry may have some challenges around cash flow and could utilize some sort of business intelligence trackers in order to manage cash flow better. So anyway, you could have a discovery-esque conversation with a prospect on your podcast, and then glean a lot of information about their business, areas that they may need help, some sort of solution. And then the important thing though is you don't want the next day to email your prospect and be like, hey, I know you mentioned this on the podcast yesterday. How about you try, such and such, product? That's a really bad look. But if you're able to gently and strategically nurture that prospect, use the podcast as a gateway to the relationship, nurture that prospect over time, send them a third-party article with some of your notes on why it's important or relative to the conversation you had. Send them a handwritten thank you with, a coffee mug with your podcast logo on it, like this one. Vistaprint, it's like $5 for these. Or a mouse pad here that has, your podcast logo, maybe like their picture here and like a really awesome quote that they had. I've also seen, if you have like a nice little display, like a picture with your podcast logo in the top corner, a quote that they had said during the interview and kind of, their name on it that they could hang up on the wall or keep on their desk as a momentum that they were on your show. It also is, something like that, like a coffee mug, mouse pad, or, picture is going to stay in front of them all the time. So it's a good nurture of your prospect that you brought onto the podcast. The other idea would be that, so say you have, a third-party article that you want to send them, some sort of momentum as a thank you for being on the show. And then maybe do a video, or maybe invite them to one of your upcoming webinars. Be like, hey, this customer of mine mentioned in our discovery that they had this sort of challenge that you had mentioned on our podcast. We're doing a webinar with them next month. Thought you might be interested. Here's the info. So a personalized invite into a value add, content like a webinar that is relative to what they mentioned on the podcast. And then eventually asking for, hey, I've been thinking about this potential solution to some of the challenges or issues that you had talked about, or I've been thinking about, how we've helped such and so company do this with their cash flow, and was wondering if you'd ever be interested in having a conversation around that, because I think there's a lot of correlation between that customer and you, and there may be something to that. And that is a low friction, easy way to kind of slide into a good conversation with the prospect. It could also, the podcast episode, if the prospect is a really good one, it will establish you to the listeners of your podcast as somebody that may be able to help them with that similar problem. That happened to me with one of the organizations that I do podcasting for. So really encourage you to consider how to bring on good guests to the podcast. So again, 3 main areas. There you go, 3. 1, credibility. Establish yourself as a credible source right out the gate. What's her name? Gwyneth Paltrow, she brought Oprah on to her first episode, establishing credibility as a thought leader, as somebody that's interesting, edutainment, as they call it, education and entertainment. Credibility, number 1, credibility. Number 2, what was number 2? Variety. There you go. Variety. Number 1, credibility. Number 2, variety. Bring a variety of content into your show that's valuable to the listener. Number 3, prospects. Bring a prospect onto your show to establish a relationship in a different way. It's really challenging in a cold call to establish rapport with a prospect. It's a lot easier if you're inviting them, say via a cold email or really nice, really nice paper invitation as an invitation to come on to the podcast as a guest to cover these 3 topics. It's an easy way to begin that conversation. begin that relationship. Brian Burns has a really good course called Start the Conversation, Get the Meeting. This is a great way to start the conversation. Value, it's important to them to feel, important. And it could also be kind of touching on the keeping up with the Joneses feeling of, hey, I'm on a credible podcast and being interviewed as a thought leader. So again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So 3 areas: credibility, variety, prospects. Those are the 3 areas that I think make a good podcast guest if you are creating a podcast as a marketing tool for your business.
Thank you. Appreciate you joining again for this episode of the Business Over Breakfast podcast. If you have not already, make sure you subscribe and leave a nice review for us on whatever podcast directory, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, that you have chosen to consume this wonderful podcast. Make sure you tune in again, and we look forward to seeing you.
Before I let you go, though, I wanted to mention, if you are a business looking for a podcast to be used in your marketing suite of content, Aura Media, AURRA.media. That is the website URL. That's the name of my business. Podcasting for businesses, selling to other businesses, and using a podcast as a marketing tool. That's what we help you do. Everything, soup to nuts, getting the podcast off the ground, inviting your guests, using it in social media and your email marketing and your blog, everything. Contact us. I'll give you my personal email address, stephen@aurra.media. Thanks.